to hear Sukanya talking on peace building. I'm delighted to have Sukanya here. She is an expert in post-conflict reconstruction, has been working with practitioners, policymakers in the field for 15 years now, and specifically works on demobilisation of armed groups, ex-combatant reintegration, youth peace building and security sector reform. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping points. If everybody could keep their mics muted, I see most people have whilst we're going. If you want to ask questions, please use the chat function throughout. If you want to ask a question live at the end, let us know. If not, we'll just read out the questions from the Q&A chat. And without further ado, I will hand over to Sukanya.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It's a pleasure to be able to present some of the research I've been doing over the last few years, and also it's linked to the research leave that I had from the department generously last term. Actually, it was in autumn of 2019. So the big question I have today is about looking at, what is the potential within technocratic peace building, which is liberal peace building through short-term projects, time-bound, to actually deliver on a more transformative, outcome. Now, I'm trying to change the slides, which I have managed to do that. So I think we really need to start off thinking about peace building with certain reality checks, in terms of what it is. It's a very dynamic process, which essentially unfolds over a very gradual, incremental, evolutionary and long-term fashion. But the way in which we try and assess the performance, the effectiveness, we try and evaluate the results from peace building, however, is very much focused on short-term single projects or multiple projects over that are donor funded and led by different sort of civil society organizations. So very much there's a tension here between short-termism in terms of how projects are designed and executed and the long-term conflict transformation outcomes, which is the bigger picture that peace building practitioners and scholars are looking at. So in a sense, what I find is that how do you go about thinking about this long-term evaluation? How do you think about what are the long-term processes, the transformative processes which take place? Because the long-term evaluation is not at all in the DNA of the peace building industry. And very few cases, one can find of actually doing longitudinal studies where you do follow-up research with various beneficiaries of projects, and there's been lots of youth-related projects that I have been involved in evaluating myself. And I think sometimes it's really important to take a pause, to look inwards, to reflect. And, in some ways, COVID-19 has given us that time to try and reflect. And I think within the peace building industry, there is need to stop and think and, find ways about not doing peace as an impatient peace. So that is where my objective really, stands today. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight is the binaries between technocratic and transformational. Essentially, the concept of time in transformational peace building essentially has to be flexible, while technical peace building is very much locked in 9 to 12 months, 6 months, cycles. And then in terms of investment, resources are linked to short-term objectives when it comes to technocratic peace building, while transformational processes require much more long-term, sort of cycles of investment. And also the question of sustainability versus, activity or output focused, objectives, which you find in technical peace building. Similarly, the other issue I find, in the many years that I've worked in different countries in Africa is that of intergenerational peace. Nobody really talks about it. Nobody thinks about it. It's all about capacity building, training, all these sort of ad hoc outputs. And of course, sustainability. We have the SDGs, we're talking about sustainability, but we don't really think about what are the ways in which we can enhance local affordability versus external financing over short periods. So essentially, these are some of the ideas which are binaries in the process. But one of the things that I pick up on is the question of legacy. And I've been working on this for a little while now, since 2014 almost. Now, in terms of peace building legacy, I define it as a long-term effects, at least 10 plus years of various interventions that are being attempted in the context of post-conflict reconstruction. Now, in terms of conceptualizing legacy, there are three things which are really helpful in trying to look at legacy. The first is time, the second is transformation, and the third is intergenerational peace. And if we were to try and measure legacy, obviously it's not going to be a quantitative measurement, but a much more qualitative, sort of interspersed with intuitive, interpretive ways of looking at issues of legacy through maybe norm resonance and retention, organizational learning and reflection, and institutionalization. So these are the three things that I look at. In many ways, my research is actually speaking to some of the live debates within peace building, from local ownership to peace building effectiveness to the question of how do you evaluate, the outcome of peace building efforts. Now, when we think about time, which is one of the ways in which we can conceptualize legacy, now there are various things, in terms of scholarship, we look at issues of bureaucratic clock time, that, that donors and, big organizations like the UN, for example, they are very bureaucratic and they have a certain sort of timeline within which they would like peace building to take place. And this is also linked to policy time, in the sense that, only today we've heard of the merger between DFID and FCO, that, it's going to be much more a foreign policy-led process in terms of development. And that policy time also links into all these peace-building efforts. And then, of course, there's the issue of time-bound projects, as I've mentioned already, and about financial accountability, usually upwards towards donors rather than local accountability to the very people that peace-building seeks to benefit. In this sense, much of the time of doing peace building is really about performance. It's about showing that you're doing lots of activities, that you're actually coming up with innovative ways of changing people's lives. But very rarely is there time to, look back, to follow up, to try and actually understand how were their lives really transformed. So that's the time dimension. The second is transformation, as I've already mentioned, conflict transformation, which is really the core objective of all these activities, which can be sort of put under peace building, grouped under peace building, is a long-term process, while essentially the way in which it is executed is very much a time-bound 9 to 12-month project-driven initiative. So fundamentally, there's a misalignment between what the principles and priorities are in terms of how donors are funding peace building versus how the implementers can actually try and effect a transformational or long-term change. And finally, this concept of intergenerational peace, having worked in West Africa for many years, lived there for some time, I can see that not only in Africa, but in many of the conflicts, for example, in Afghanistan and Palestine, and definitely in South Sudan, these conflicts have changed over time and across generations because they're so long drawn. And therefore, peace building efforts have also to respond to the different generations and the generational needs. And I often feel that that is not the case. There is not really an understanding of how conflict shapes, the social dynamic within which peace building takes effect. And in this sense, one of the areas which I really look at is values and norms and how these are being transmitted. We have a lot of literature on hybridity. We have a lot of literature on friction, in terms of the local and the global. But very few are actually looking at the long-term process of transformation through, how far norms are actually internalized and retained. So in terms of modes of norm transmission, the various modes could be through media, through schools, through family, through religion. And there is a vast amount of literature which looks at these specific elements, but not so much as a macro issue. So in terms of measuring legacy, there are these three things that I want to talk about. The first is how far norms introduced by peace building efforts or projects or activities, however you want to define it, actually resonate, or how far are they retained by the beneficiaries, by the communities of intervention. And I think that can be a really good cue for understanding long-term effects, right? The second is looking at how do you institutionalize, how do you adapt, how do you take the learning, the benefits, the learning from various projects and activities that take place within local settings and actually adopt them into national systems, in a way that there is sustainability, in a way that there is an effort to actually capture, a long-term vision of change. And finally, I think one of the issues which has been flagged in recent scholarship about learning and reflection. Many of these organizations, and I've worked closely with several of them, are now developing a very, sort of more structured approach to learning and reflection, to institutional learning. And by institutional learning, I mean the very organizations, the civil society actors, for example, which is the focus of my research, how they are trying to look at the cumulative evidence from documents, archives, of various evaluations, of the institutional memory, which is the human memory of staff, in terms of understanding those human processes, as well as the evidence which is accumulated over several years of 10 plus years that usually organizations are in a particular country doing different types of projects, in terms of how that organizational learning can also impact on the legacy that is left behind by these very organizations, the peace building organizations that I'm talking about. So in terms of norm resonance and retention, I think one of the cues is to look at how far the outlook, and here I measure attitude change in terms of how far the norms that were transmitted actually led to a substantive change in terms of values and attitudes. And I find that when these norms resonate strongly with local settings, with local value systems and local experiences that were shaped by the conflict, it is very likely that they will have a stronger legacy in terms of peace building. The second is about institutionalization and adaptation. I've already mentioned this, that there has to be a way through which these projects that are funded by donors need to be taken over, adopted into national government procedures, into national government departments, into their systems, or by local successor organizations. And this is the way in which we can enhance the transformational potential of technocratic peace building and also enhance local ownership and sustainability agendas, right? So when we talk about the third element, which is institutional learning and reflection, I think there are certain methodologies, and I've been working with collaborators looking at some of these. The first is looking at, from health systems research and also, education research. There is a lot of emphasis on looking at meta studies, in looking at metadata, but doing ethnographic synthesis of, meta-ethnographic synthesis of all these archival data. And it takes a long time, but if one is able to code and, come up with secondary interpretations of the values that were transmitted, it's an excellent way of looking at, legacy. And the other way, which is much more difficult because of the resource constraints that plague peace building as a enterprise, I call it, is that post-closure evaluations of follow-up research. And finally, working with communities to try and set up indigenous monitoring and evaluation, which is another area that I'm working on concurrently with this project. So in terms of how I went about this project, I entered into a knowledge production partnership with a leading peacebuilding NGO called Search for Common Ground. And I worked with their country teams in Sierra Leone and in North Macedonia, and also with their main institutional learning team based in Washington, D.C. And one of my collaborators was Saji Prelis, who is Saji Prelis in the sense that he's a lead on the youth, peace and security agenda with the UN, but he's also their chief of programs with the children and youth programs for Search. Now, it was funded by the British Academy through a small grant. And I looked at these children and youth programs run in these two countries. I undertook field work, one phase of field work in each country. But I also spent a lot of time looking at all the documentation of these various projects through meta-ethnographic synthesis, archival ethnography, and I also did follow-up interviews with evaluators and different country staff. Now, in terms of Macedonia, if anybody has worked on the Western Balkans would know that it's an inter-ethnic conflict between the majority Macedonians and the Albanians, and a result of collapse of the former Yugoslavia, one of the successor states. But it did not have a conflict immediately after the collapse. It was actually after 10 years that there was a conflict, and it was relatively, not as violent as some of the conflicts in Kosovo, for example. And the main peace agreement was Ohrid Framework Agreement of 2001. And the issue there was about language and language equality. And therefore, one of the issues that I looked at was peace education and media and theater and intercultural communication. Now, using meta-ethnography, I was able to look at the country staff, how they implemented the project over 15 years. This involved a long time trying to go through all their archives, looking at their institutional memory, talking to the staff, looking at timelines, working with the different theory of change reports that they had. So it was a really time-consuming but a very enriching process in terms of understanding legacy. Now, one of the case studies within the Macedonia project was to look at these kindergarten groups, bilingual groups, where both Macedonian and Albanian was introduced to children between 3 to 6 years. That was the age group that I was dealing with. And these kindergarten groups actually were a cue for integrated education, intercultural communication. And what happened is that at the time they were introduced in 1997, they were no novelty, and they attracted a lot of attention because they provided quality preschool education at a time, and there was a real gap for this. So in many ways, the normative sort of emphasis on bilinguality, on intercultural communication was secondary in terms of the value added of these groups. But the main sort of takeaway from this is the objective right from the beginning was to hand over this project or model to the government to make it a nationally owned project. And so this institutionalization theme was really important with the Mosaic example. But when I did sort of this archival ethnography and timeline of the project over time, I could see how adaptation over time actually diluted some of the essential, sort of focus on intercultural communication, through institutionalization. Although, I want to sort of emphasize that institutionalization is really important if you want a strong legacy. It also results in what I would call normative distortion. In some ways, there was a great deal of push from the EU, from donors, towards integrated education, social cohesion, these concepts, but very superficially sort of adapted in terms of how far the norm resonated, how far the norm was actually internalized. So I found that with regard to institutionalization, although it was one of the elements of success of the project, and it can be used as evidence of how long-term sustainability legacy can be incorporated into peace-building work, make it really sustainable and transformative. I find that there are also issues with how institutionalization affects this norm transmission processes, because the evaluations by themselves did not, report on the social capital dynamic, which was one of the most important findings of my meta-ethnographic synthesis, was that families, the way they socialize with each other across intergroup boundaries, actually shaped the way in which the norm transmission took place. So in areas like Deba, where they had long-standing familial relations, they socialized on a routine basis, children who left these mosaic groups and went into segregated education once they're from primary school onwards, were actually, were able to keep in touch much more compared to other areas like Skopje, where there was much more, sort of segregation between families. Okay. Now, Sierra Leone, I looked at various youth projects, and I was especially looking at youth and radio. So I looked at this huge timeline, 17 years of radio projects, right? And community work alongside, in which they also did what they call community engagement projects. So from DDR, which was the ex-combatant reintegration program, right up to elections, there've been a huge variety, and you can understand the amount of data I have in terms of going through all this. So one of the findings here, and I really want to highlight the finding, is that in media programs, I found that the norm transmission element was quite unexpected, because the measuring results from media programs is that much more dispersed, it's much more difficult to collate. In the West African case, I find that radio sensitization was very effective in terms of advocacy around human rights, around gender, around participation in elections, nonviolent politics. So there are certain areas where there is discernible progress in terms of change, in terms of transformation, in terms of people's attitude change, right? But often I find in both cases, in the Macedonia case and in the Sierra Leone case, that, in terms of actually adapting projects, revisiting theories of change, in terms of looking back, following up with beneficiaries, in both cases, this was extremely weak. The other issue is about planning exits early. And I think that is one of the issues of handover and successor organizations. And this was not taking place. And this is a cue that we need to think about legacy early. We need to think about, sustainability and exit, and undertake, if possible, post-closure evaluation, actually dedicate funds so that there is an element of follow-up. Unlike Macedonia and Sierra Leone, I find the institutional link was very weak. There was accidental institutionalization, I call, of community radio infrastructure, particularly the independent radio network, which has been key to the electoral advocacy that has carried on right up to 2018. So it's very much a part of the media landscape in Sierra Leone. There are certain successor organizations which very likely will take on once search leaves, but there has not been, as of yet, there's been nationalization of staff, but there has not yet been that implementation, although there, this recommendation of having successor organizations or exit strategies was, recommended in 2004. So you can imagine how projects have been prolonged, they have been, added on, and there's an entire, sort of different presentation looking at how these organizations evolve over time within a particular country context. So in terms of just completing my presentation, this transformative piece can be looked at, as I said, through understanding norm resonance and retention. I found that if there is low resonance, there is often superficial adoption or no adoption, and therefore rejection of these norms, even when there is legal adoption. For example, with Macedonia, where integrated education is very much a part of the policy of the government, but at the societal level, it just doesn't take off. In Sierra Leone, I found that in certain areas, particularly because of the intergenerational tensions which characterize the conflict in Sierra Leone, in human rights, for example, the young people, women who have been marginalized in society were very much in favor of adopting those behaviors, which protected their rights, which helped them, sort of come forward and voice their concerns. Therefore, it's very much an instrumental adoption, looking at norms from the perspective of, how it would further their own status and, sort of influence in society. So these were the elements. And then finally, I think, reiterating the importance of learning and reflection. I cannot quite, underline this boldly enough, that we need more, we need to think about donor funding a little bit. And this is one of the areas that I want to pick up on later, is how mechanisms of funding, need to be much more sectoral, in the sense that you need to fund certain organizations to do in-depth work in certain areas within a country, in certain communities, so that there is repeated interventions with the same organizations, and there is a relationship over time that is built with the beneficiaries, and there is follow-up. And from an organizational perspective, and perspective of CSOs, peace building organizations, I think maintaining continuity, archiving, and the institutional memory, thinking about exit, thinking about successor organizations, thinking about how best to hand over the learning, the benefits from their various projects to the government or to local organizations. These are really important areas in thinking about legacy. And finally, institutionalization, as I mentioned, so working with communities, working with NGOs, working with local CSOs in ways that there is an element of succession. Otherwise, what happens is, and I found this very much happening in Sierra Leone, is that you have these ad hoc structures from child welfare committees, youth groups, women's groups. These last as long as the funding lasts, and then people just go back to doing what they were doing before. Communities just fall back on their basic social learning, and that is one of the areas we don't emphasize enough in peace building. The fact that during conflict, there is a great deal of resilience that communities demonstrate. There is a great deal of learning and wartime institutions and governance, which often is just dismissed, and we start from scratch trying to build top-down structures, strong state, decentralization, you name it. So I feel that there is a bit of a disconnect in terms of not quite understanding or harnessing the potential within technocratic peace building for transformative peace. And this is where I would like to end my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sukanya. That was great. I can't see any questions on the side in the meeting chat. If anyone's got questions, either raise your hand, put it in the meeting chat. I've just, Sukanya, just a quick, I noticed on one of those slides you had follow-up research. I wonder what your plans are in terms of following up on any of this.
So one of the things that I'm working on, again with Saji and Jimmy, who's now head of the Liberia and Sierra Leone office, is to look very specifically at institutions, in terms of institutional building. So when I was in Liberia, for example, there was a network of youth organizations that I work with called the Federation of Liberian Youth, FLY. And this network is a very much grassroots network, which links into the much more formal organizations like the Ministry of Youth, for example. And we are trying to figure out how best this institutionalization element, in terms of legacy works. It's still sort of nebulous in terms of concept. But when I meant follow-up research, I also meant that peace-building organizations need to follow up in terms of the work that they've done if they are going to think about legacy, if they are going to think about transformation, because you cannot kind of pick up your bags and leave and say bye. We folded our operations, so we're gone, we've moved on to another country where donors have also moved. But I think to have a moral compass, to have the intention, to have long-term effect, it is really important to be committed to follow-up research.
Okay, thank you. I can see we've got a couple of people with their hands up. I think I've got Janine and Richard, if you want to unmute and ask your questions.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can. Hi.
Okay, I posted something in the meeting chat. I'm the editor of the International Journal of Conflict Management, so I'm always very interested in studies like this. I'm really impressed by your model. Let me just say, we get a lot of manuscripts submitted to the journal that talk about case studies for particular countries. Now, this study is strongly founded on more than one country, Macedonia and Sierra Leone. But my question would be, the model looks very good, but how applicable will this model be to conflicts in other geographic locations? Like, what about North and South Korea? What about Israel and Palestine? I mean, there's so many other conflicts around the world. So what do you think about that?
So I think that's a good question. Thank you, Richard. In terms of the peace building legacy model, the way in which I conceptualize it is very much linked to countries and contexts where you've had peace building, where you've had externally led interventions in ways that are trying to reconstruct the state and to reconstruct institutions top down. And in many of the African countries, as well as in countries in the weaker countries where the state is weak, we find that liberal peace building, even the Balkans, for example, Bosnia, Kosovo, we have seen this deep intervention in terms of liberal actors, from writing documents to seconding people, to help build their armies, to help build their defense departments. So there is a deep intervention. These are what we call heavy footprint interventions. And the peace building legacy model kind of works with these conflicts because of the intrusive nature of liberal peace building, because of the big role that civil society organizations, donor-funded peace-building organizations play. And I think it would not apply to contexts where we have interstate conflict, because that level of intervention would not exist.
Janine, did you want to ask your question? No. So I've got Janine with her hand up, but no question. Anyone else? Questions? There's nothing in the chat.
I wonder if anybody had any feedback or thoughts about the model, because I think I would really benefit from thinking about this more carefully.
Sukanya, there is a question here. How does elite bargains play in to all of this?
I think elite bargains is very much part of the state building process. You cannot have post-conflict democracy work, in the sense that, democratization, which is institutionalization before liberalization, the role in Paris model. So democracy is sort of taken as a cue, starting point where you have this institutional building, peace building efforts take off. And I think elite bargains are really important in terms of the very peace agreement, which enables the process to start. But I think in terms of the legacy perspective, rather than an elite bargain, it has to be, state investment and state complicity in some ways, ownership to this process of institutionalization. Unless the state, the national governments are willing to, adopt some of the models which are effective, and there are many, developmental models which work very well in some of these countries. But I think there's a missing link in terms of what is being done at a micro level in different communities and which work, and versus whether that learning is actually transferred to the government level, where you can sustain that effort beyond donor-funded projects.
There's a follow-up to that question along the lines of, have you experienced NGOs crowding each other out? Are you setting different goals or having different uncoordinated aims?
Very much so. That's a really good point. And, because there's only 20-25 minutes to cover the huge amount of data that I have. One of the things which is actually being tried through consortiums of different peacebuilding organizations is that there is an emphasis on inter-organizational learning. And one of the things that I was mentioning about donor funding, that's sort of deciding on this sectoral separation, that certain organizations lead in certain areas, whether it's health, whether it's children's rights. It often happens in a sectoral basis, but I think there's often overlap and competition for donor funding. But it is at cross purposes. So one of the better ways to work is through inter-organizational sharing of knowledge, of inter-organizational learning, which is actually taking off. There are several organizations, including Search, which are invested in this process through the CDA Collaborative, through Alliance for Peacebuilding, and similar sort of networks. So yes, I have come across this.
Okay, I've got Chris with his hand up, and Janine still the hand up. If you want to ask Chris, do you want to go?
Okay, very interesting, Sukanya. It's a very simple question. Is there a role for the commercial sector to play in this process? And the reason I asked that is because, of course, Dynacorp was the company that initially trained the Liberian military. I think it was back in the late 90s or after the war had finished. They got a large contract paid for by the State Department, I believe. So is there a place for the commercial sector here or not?
I think the kind of objectives that I'm in terms of transformation, I think if we were thinking about security sector transformation, if we were thinking about building up militaries and armies and navies and whatever, I think the private military or security agencies, companies would have a transformational role. But this project in particular, Chris, has looked at more the sort of community-based, needs-based process, whether it's in terms of empowerment, in terms of rights, in terms of democratization. And I think by definition, it is civil society organizations which have been the de facto sort of donor arm in implementing these kinds of conflict transformation peace building processes.
I understand your answer. I wasn't actually thinking about necessarily the military side. You know, societies need to transform, and part of that transformation is developing businesses, developing opportunities for the young people. And that's what I mean by the commercial sector. I'm not actually talking about the military side at all.
I get your point.
For instance.
I get your point. So one of the areas actually is about employment generation. As you know, livelihoods is a really big issue in most of these countries where we have peace building taking place. And whether it's through DDR processes, as you're well aware, or it is through civil society initiatives of, you know, sort of having similar to microcredit lending or micro businesses, in which you bring communities together, or, you know, women's groups together so that they can be self-sufficient. And I've worked with some of these sort of groups. The point I want to make is that, and I go back to that example of, as long as there is donor funding, you know, I have a example here. So this was regarding agriculture. This was regarding, you know, cashew nuts or some sort of crop. And the donors were supposed to give them seedlings, you know, for the crop, and they helped them sort of set up all the business and how they would, you know, sort of have the expertise in terms of, you know, selling in the market and being a cooperative and doing things. But what happened with the project is, although it was successful in the first year, in the second year, and this is how simple it is to fix these things. In the second year, instead of using the profit from the sale of produce in the first year, the sale of produce profit was used for other investments rather than reinvesting in the business. So what happened is they had to rely on fresh seed to be supplied the following year. And because of various, you know, weather-related issues, you know, those supplies came much later than anticipated, and therefore the crop failed. And when the crop failed, you know, they found that they had made losses in their businesses, and they also did not have, you know, the financial training to do budgets and, you know, sort of match their books, so to speak. So all I'm trying to say is that there is definitely, you know, need for developing the commercial potential, the livelihoods potential of various activities that are implemented in communities, and to link it with the government, where I talk about institutionalization. But I often find, and this is related to the donor short-term vision of how peace building should work, that this is disconnected from the bigger picture, disconnected from how governments would go about doing microcredit. And therefore you have these multiple activities sort of atomized in their own islands, you know, happening in their own islands, while there is no big picture, no strategic thinking of how they can feed into a bigger, you know, sort of objective of livelihoods transformation. I hope that answers your question.
No, that's very interesting. It certainly has. And yes, thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions out there? Anyone still got their hand up?
Yes, hi. This is Janine.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. So you made this point earlier where you talked about that on the road to transformative peace, the donor funding side has to change by making sure that funding is a more long-term investment, maybe also thinking about sort of having a program instead of just single projects. Mm. And I do have some experience in working for donors, but also for larger organizations. And I don't know if I really see that. And I think this might be the problem, that these donors that I have experience with, the budget for funding would be yearly. And they would have to really explain why they wanted to give money to a specific organization. And sometimes it can also be, even though it doesn't really make sense, that people would be arguing, why are you continuing to fund this organization for such a long time? This is some sort of like dependency. The project should be successful, and then they won't need funding anymore. So I wonder what you see about that, how we can change that, because it would basically mean a overhaul of the entire way the donor system works.
Yeah, thank you, Janine. I think this is an area in which I haven't personally worked, but from my interactions with practitioners what I find is that there is a push now within across the field, if we call peace building a field, across the field there is a push and a drive as part of the SDGs to engage with donors over funding mechanisms. So I'm not saying that donor accountability will disappear, or that transparency in terms of who is getting funding for how long, those constraints and checks will remain in place. But I think it is a sort of field-wide understanding on specializing, specializations. Certain organizations, as we already know, are better in developmental areas, whether it's water sanitation, WASH, for example, or there are other organizations which are better with human rights, gender, children's rights, and things like that. So what happens is, instead of having a legacy perspective, would require thinking about long-term investments. Now, donor funding, I'm not saying that it will be rolling, but I think there will be a much more open to working with certain organizations in certain areas as we move towards more consortia for funding, that they split areas and sectors, and they split also geographic locations, so that there is repeated interventions in the same geographies through the same organizations. And that is how you create a strong sort of feedback mechanism, you create legacy perspectives in terms of, okay, so we are doing a long-term commitment. I'm not sure whether funding will move from being 1 year to 10 years at one go, but I think it can definitely move from working with multiple organizations doing patchwork, peace building as I call it, to actually having a much more strategic thinking around investing in certain areas, and then sort of deeper rather than wider intervention. I hope that helps.
Okay. Are there any more questions out there?
I have a last one. Is that okay, Tracy?
Of course, please do. Go ahead.
Now, Sukanya, you don't have to answer this question.
Chris.
And I'll throw in my penny's worth as well. Johnson has just announced that he's bringing DFID back into the FCO. And of course, you've done a lot of work and DFID. I see this as a hugely bad move. I think it will politicise the work of DFID for the wrong reasons. And he's more or less stated that already. How do you view this particular move? Because it's going to affect, I would imagine, your sector more than anything, really.
I think one of the things that I've read on this, and this is obviously not an area that I've researched, but from my interpretation of what I've read, I feel it has a lot to do with refocusing energies. So the Prime Minister's vision is that certain areas require greater backing in terms of intervention. And for example, the Western Balkans is one of the areas that he's highlighted versus Africa, Tanzania, or I think Zambia or some other country was cited. So in some ways, I can understand that, the value for money, which is part of every research council funding or donor funding application, is now filtering into government speak, in the sense that, we now have a government which wants to put its buck where it wants to enhance its influence. So from an objective perspective, and I know people will not like it, but I think from an objective perspective, it is actually more strategic, because, there are certain areas in which Ethiopia, for example, a lot of money has gone in from DFID, but I'm not sure as to how much the presence in the Horn of Africa has actually, I'm not an expert. There are other people. I can see Julian is here, who's a, stabilization advisor to Somalia recently, and also DRC, so he would be better placed to speak. But I personally don't know as to how far strategic objectives are advanced through random investments. So in some ways, I think it is a strategic move. It will affect, of course, how much money goes to some of the poorer, struggling countries. And it might very well change the nature of DFID's, sort of influence in terms of post-conflict peace building. But I think in a post-COVID world, we will anyway see a shrinking sector and a sector which has to be much more creative in terms of, working locally in the field, I mean.
Okay. Do you find that, and sorry for butting in, that this may be linked with, as has happened in the past, this idea that, well, we give you aid as long as you buy British goods, and that we could find ourselves going down this path, or am I being too pessimistic?
I know that there is an element of selling kit versus, giving aid. But I'm not sure as to, and I'm no expert on NATO and other things, which Tracy is, by the way, in terms of how it shapes this, countering the Russian threat and, investing in the Balkans and in, sort of countering that more immediate threat in terms of strategic, objectives. I'm not sure as to whether that is, selling kit is the main idea behind this reorientation, to be honest. But there are other people who would know more about this.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Chris. I didn't mean that you shut up.
Julian's got his hand up, I'd like to say.
Thank you, and hello, Sukanya, and thank you for mentioning me. I'm currently working in the British High Commission in Abuja on a Home Office programme. And the whole time I've been there, we have this one HMG concept. So all my colleagues, whether they're DFID, Ministry of Defence, Home Office, consultants, we will absolutely work together. Now, Abuja has, or Nigeria has, the biggest mission in Africa. We employ, or the High Commission employs, over 500 people, both UK-based, locally employed. So I think this has been some time coming. I mean, Nigeria has been used slightly as a test bed as to how this would work. And I have to say it works very well. If you come into the High Commission, there's no real feeling of them and us. And the High Commissioner and the senior DFID officer work hand in hand, because we're actually all trying to work together to assist Nigeria in a whole host of different ways. And it actually potentially is much more efficient if you are all working together than if you are in two sort of separate pigeonholes doing your own thing. I know the budget is a big issue. And for example, one of the issues in Abuja is that all the drivers who work for DFID get paid more than all the drivers who work for the Foreign Office, which really upsets the drivers who work for the Foreign Office. Now, hopefully this all gets sorted out. So there are all sorts of little kinks in the system which will be evened out. But I think, we're going to have to give it time to see how well it works. But there is a lot of enthusiasm about it. And as soon as this meeting has finished, I'll be in a meeting with the High Commissioner in which she is going to explain to us exactly how this is going to work, because it's going to have to be up and running by September. Anyway, that's my perspective from someone who's actually inside the system at the moment. Thank you.
Good to hear from you.
Okay. I don't see any further questions in the chat or hands up that haven't already asked. So if there are no further questions out there for Sukanya, I'd like to thank her very much for that fascinating presentation. There have been a few questions about whether you'll share the slides with all those who've participated today, Sukanya. So if you could, that would be great. We've also recorded the meeting and it will be publicised on social media. So I think for those that joined a bit later, they'll be able to catch up at the beginning. But thank you ever so much, everybody, for participating. And thank you, Sukanya.
Thank you, Tracy, for organizing the seminars. I've been 4 years in the department, and this is my first seminar during COVID on webinar. But I wish I had, done this earlier so that, the department also gets an understanding of the kind of work that I've been doing. And I think I do want to share these ideas more fully, and not only just work with practitioners, but also through the military in terms of their own work in defense engagement, for example. But thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Thanks, Sukanya. See you soon.
Thank you.